Last episode, we found out the Kybalion was written in 1908, a modern book dressed up as ancient wisdom. But its central claim, that the universe is fundamentally mental, did not come from nowhere. Atkinson did not invent it, he inherited it from a text written roughly 1,600 years before he ever picked up a pen, buried inside a collection known as the Corpus Hermeticum. For 150 years, Renaissance Europe believed it predated Moses himself. In 1614, one scholar proved that belief wrong in a matter of weeks. But proving when a text was written is not the same as proving what it says is false. This episode is about the real ancestor of the Kybalion's biggest claim, and whether any of it actually holds up. In 1460, Greek manuscripts attributed to a figure called Hermes Trismegistus arrived in Florence, sent to Cosimo de' Medici's court. Marsilio Ficino translated them into Latin. What emerged became known as the Corpus Hermeticum, 17 dialogues and visions centered on teachings passed from Hermes to his pupils. The first of those 17, and by far the most influential, was Poimandres. It is the text this episode is built around, and it is the text that did more than any other to convince Renaissance Europe it was reading something impossibly old. For the next century and a half, educated Europe believed these texts predated Moses, predated Plato. Some believed they predated the pyramids. This mattered enormously, and it is worth understanding why. If Hermes had genuinely written before the Hebrew patriarchs, his teachings represented something unprecedented, the first human contact with divine truth, untouched by any single religious tradition, and arguably the hidden source underneath all of them. Scholars called this the Prisca Theologia, the ancient theology. Pico della Mirandola built philosophical systems on it. Giordano Bruno would later be burned at the stake for ideas substantially drawn from it. For a century and a half, this was treated as one of the most important documents humanity possessed. It was not what anyone believed it to be. In 1614, the philologist Isaac Casaubon settled the question definitively. The Greek of the Corpus Hermeticum was not the Greek of ancient Egypt, nor the Greek of Plato's era. It was Koine Greek, a form of the language that only developed after Alexander the Great, centuries after Plato had already died. The vocabulary itself was the proof. Terms like demiurge, nous, and logos were specific to Hellenistic philosophy. They could not have existed in the time of Moses, because the philosophical tradition that produced them did not yet exist. Casaubon also found traces of distinctly Christian theological language embedded in the text, concepts the supposed dating made impossible. His conclusion? The Corpus Hermeticum was written in the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era, almost certainly in Alexandria, where Egyptian religious tradition, Greek philosophy, and early Christian and Jewish thought were colliding in the same intellectual environment. The prestige built over a century and a half collapsed within years. Modern scholarship has confirmed Casaubon's dating ever since. On the question of when the Corpus Hermeticum was written, the matter is settled. On the question of whether anything it says is worth taking seriously, the matter is not. Casaubon answered when the words were written. He did not answer what they mean. The real test of Poimandres was never going to be its date. It was always going to be its claims. So let's test them. Poimandres is not a list of principles. It is a vision. The narrator, presumably Hermes himself, describes entering an altered state, his bodily senses suspended, and encountering a vast presence identifying itself as the mind of absolute sovereignty. What follows is a single, continuous revelation covering the origin of the cosmos, the nature of the human being, and the path back to the divine source. 5 claims inside that vision are worth examining on their own terms, not as history, but as philosophy. The first claim is that mind precedes matter. Poimandres declares that before anything else existed, there was only mind, and that the entire physical cosmos was generated from it, not the other way around. This is the root of what the Kybalion would later flatten into a single sentence: the all is mind. But here it is not a principle to apply. It is a metaphysical claim about the actual structure of reality, and it places the Corpus Hermeticum inside a much older and far more serious philosophical lineage than Atkinson ever acknowledged. The position is called idealism, and it has been defended by serious philosophers from antiquity through to the present. Plotinus built an entire system on a strikingly similar premise within a few centuries of this text being written.
The hard problem of consciousness, still entirely unresolved in modern philosophy of mind, keeps this question open in a way that should give any confident dismissal pause. Whether mind is fundamental or derivative remains, after 2,000 years, a live dispute rather than a settled one. The second claim concerns how the cosmos actually came to exist. Mind generates a second principle, the logos, reason, or word, which separates the four elements from one another. From this, a craftsman intelligence called the demiurge fashions 7 governing powers, associated with the 7 classical planets, who in turn shape and administer the material world according to fixed law. This is not a creation story in the biblical sense of a single divine command. It is a layered, almost mechanical emanation. Mind producing reason, reason producing structure, structure producing law. The philosopher would develop something remarkably similar 2 centuries later in his account of how the one gives rise to intellect, then soul, then the material world. Whether this layered model captures anything true about how reality is actually structured is a separate question from whether it is internally coherent. And on the second count, it holds together with more rigor than its mythological packaging might suggest at first glance. The third claim concerns what a human being actually is. The text describes a primal figure, the anthropos, created directly in the image of mind and granted authority over the cosmos by the 7 governing powers. This figure looks down, sees its own reflection in the material world below, falls in love with that reflection, and as a result becomes bound to physical form, retaining a spark of the original divine mind, but now trapped within matter. Strip away the mythological staging, and what remains is a genuinely serious claim that human beings are composite, divided between something that participates in pure intellect and something that is merely biological and mortal. This dual nature account of the self is not unique to Hermeticism. It runs through Platonism, through later Gnostic Christianity, and arguably survives in a secular form in modern distinctions between conscious, deliberate reasoning and automatic biological impulse. The packaging is myth. The underlying claim about a divided human nature has had a very long philosophical afterlife. The fourth claim is the most architecturally specific, and that specificity is worth sitting with carefully. After bodily death, the text describes the soul ascending back through the 7 planetary spheres, surrendering one corrupting quality at each level. First, the capacity to grow and diminish, then the machinery of evil device, then deceptive desire, then domineering arrogance, and so on, until it arrives, stripped of all of them, at the 8th sphere and beyond it, full reunion with the divine source. The doctrine is built on a specific planetary model, a fixed Earth, 7 spheres in concentric motion, each exerting a distinct moral influence. The more interesting question, separate from any specific planetary architecture, is whether the symbolic core of this doctrine, a path of progressively shedding lower impulses on the way toward a more integrated, less corrupted self, carries independent value regardless of which cosmological model happens to be fashionable in a given century.
That is a question about psychology and ethics, and it can be asked on its own terms, without needing either the ancient cosmology or the modern one to have the final say. The fifth and final claim is the simplest, and arguably the one that is aged best. Poimandres tells Hermes directly, "The one who has come to know himself enters into the good." Salvation in this text is not granted through ritual, sacrifice, or external authority. It is achieved through self-knowledge, an accurate understanding of one's own divided nature, divine and material at once. This was not a new idea even by the standards of the 2nd century. Centuries before Poimandres was written, the maxim, "Know thyself," was already inscribed at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, and Socrates had already built an entire method of philosophy around the conviction that the unexamined life was not worth living. Whoever wrote this text was not inventing the claim. They were inheriting it and placing it at the very center of a cosmic vision.
The Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius filled his private notebook, what survives today as the Meditations, almost entirely with self-examination, the same conviction in a different vocabulary. Centuries later, the psychologist Carl Jung studied the Hermetic and Gnostic literature directly and built much of his theory of individuation around a strikingly similar premise, that psychological wholeness requires confronting and integrating the parts of the self a person would rather not look at, divine and shadow alike. Jung did not arrive at this by accident. He read these exact texts and took their central claim seriously enough to rebuild it inside a clinical framework. And the thread does not stop with serious philosophy or clinical psychology. It runs directly into the modern self-help tradition as well, including, with a certain irony, the very movement that produced the Kybalion. The New Thought authors of the early 20th century, William Walker Atkinson among them, built their entire genre on the conviction that self-knowledge and self-mastery were the keys to a transformed life. That same basic structure, look inward, understand your true nature, and your circumstances will change as a result, runs through a century of best-selling self-improvement writing that followed, largely without its readers ever knowing how far back the idea actually goes. Of the 5 claims examined here, this is the one that requires the least translation to remain intelligible to a contemporary reader. Socrates took it seriously. Marcus Aurelius lived by it. Jung rebuilt a school of psychology on it. An entire modern publishing genre has quietly run on it for over 100 years, frequently without crediting where it came from. Perhaps that is the most honest measure of what in this text has genuinely endured. Not because it was ancient, but because something about the claim itself keeps proving useful to whoever encounters it. Step back from all 5 claims at once, and something stranger than a simple verdict emerges. A vision recorded by an anonymous author in Roman Egypt 19 centuries ago did not simply speculate about ancient concerns that have since been settled and moved past. It is still, in a genuinely unsettling way, describing arguments we are currently having. Whether mind precedes matter is a live dispute in philosophy of mind. The layered architecture of mind, producing reason, producing structure, would resurface, almost unchanged in shape, in Plotinus, and echoes still further in how some physicists and philosophers today describe layers of emergence in the universe. The divided self, intellect pulling one way, biology pulling another, is not a relic. It is close to how modern psychology still describes internal conflict. And the claim that self-knowledge is the actual mechanism of transformation did not stay buried in a forgotten Egyptian vision. It traveled through Socrates, through Marcus Aurelius, through Jung's consulting room, and into the self-help section of every modern bookstore, usually with no one along the way realizing how old the idea actually was.
None of this proves the text was right. It proves something quieter and more interesting, that whoever wrote it was wrestling with questions that have never actually closed. 20 centuries have not resolved them. They have only changed the vocabulary we use to keep asking. If this kind of investigation is what you came here for, subscribing is the best way to follow where it leads. New episodes examine the Hermetic tradition from every angle: philosophy, history, science, and the record of human experience. So, where does the genuine Hermetic text actually leave us? Not where Kybalion left it. Knowing that the Corpus Hermeticum was written in the 2nd or 3rd century, not at the dawn of civilization, settles a historical question. It does not settle a philosophical one. A claim about the nature of mind is not strengthened by being old, and it is not weakened by being newer than once believed. It has to be evaluated on its own terms. And on those terms, this text holds several claims still worth taking seriously, alongside questions that modern philosophy and neuroscience have not closed. This episode's title made the scope clear from the outset, and it is worth honoring that clarity here at the close. Poimandres is the first of 17 treatises in the Corpus Hermeticum, the most influential, but only one voice in a much larger conversation. The remaining 16 cover their own ground, different dialogues, different teachers, different angles on the same underlying tradition, and they remain entirely untouched here. That territory is exactly as large as it sounds, and it is still waiting.
This brings the investigation back to a promise made at the end of episode 1. The principle of mentalism, the claim that the universe is fundamentally mental, did not originate with William Walker Atkinson in 1908. It is the simplified, secularized descendant of the very first claim examined in this episode. Poimandres' assertion that mind precedes matter, made 19 centuries ago by an author whose name we will never know. That is the question this channel now owes a full investigation of its own. Not whether the idea is ancient, not whether it is fashionable, but whether mind being fundamental to reality is something modern philosophy and modern science can rule in, rule out, or only continue to leave open. That investigation begins next. If this is the kind of inquiry you have been looking for, rigorous, honest, and genuinely open, subscribe and follow along. Every episode takes one question from the Hermetic tradition and examines it from every direction available to us.